They told her, "This seat isn't for someone like you." She didn't argue. She moved quietly. But what followed wasn't silence. It was a national reckoning. This is a flight that never took off. Seat 3B, first class on Soul Air Flight 1827, belonged to a 16-year-old girl named Amira Bennett. She sat quietly, her back resting gently against a soft leather seat, arms wrapped around a navy blue backpack balanced on her lap. Her printed boarding pass, bearing her name, was tucked inside the pocket of her gray hoodie, right over a heart still beating fast from her very first solo journey. This wasn't a regular trip. It was a gift, a reward from her godmother, Naomi Carter, who had bought her the first-class ticket after Amira completed a summer science program with top honors. She didn't talk to anyone, just wore her headphones loosely around her neck, eyes watching soft reflections of light flicker across the window as other passengers filed onto the plane. A man in a business suit muttered into his phone across the aisle. A flight attendant helped an elderly woman with her carry-on. No one noticed the quiet, polite girl in seat 3B. No one until the heels came clicking. Karen Whitmore, the lead flight attendant, sharp-eyed and stiff in posture, strode down the aisle like she was performing a security sweep. She paused at row 3. At first, her look was routine. Then her gaze landed on Amira, and the polite smile on Karen's face vanished. "You're in the wrong seat," Karen said, her voice louder than necessary, like she wanted people to hear. Amira looked up, frowning gently. "I think this is 3B, she replied softly, confused but polite. She held out her boarding pass with both hands. Karen snatched it, scanned it quickly, and narrowed her eyes. "This is first class. Are you traveling with an adult? Where are your parents?" The question didn't just land. It echoed in the hush of the cabin. It rang out loud. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. But no one said a word. Amira stayed calm. "I'm traveling alone. My godmother bought the ticket." Karen drew in a breath, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense. You need to move to economy. You're holding up the boarding process." "But this is the seat on my ticket." Karen's voice dropped, but it cut colder now. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but unless you want to be removed from the aircraft, I suggest you cooperate." No one stood up. No one intervened. A man looked down at his phone. A woman behind her quietly adjusted her eye mask. Amira saw it clearly. They all heard. They all saw. But none of them planned to speak. She rose, backpack pressed tight to her chest, and walked down that long aisle like it was a corridor built for quiet humiliation. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. But something in her chest cracked, and as she sat by the window in the last row of economy, the runway lights outside suddenly felt a world away, as if all her effort, her grades, her scholarships, her godmother's promise, had just been dismissed by a single look. No one knew that a single text message, just one line, was about to ground an entire flight before it ever left the runway. Amira Bennett sat silently by the window in seat 27F. She wasn't crying, but her hands, wrapped around her backpack, were clenched tighter than before. Karen Whitmore's words still echoed in her head like the sharp click of heels on marble. "You don't belong here. Go back to economy." Amira pulled out her phone from the front pocket of her hoodie. Her fingers trembled as she typed. "She kicked me out of my seat. Said I shouldn't be in first class. I'm in the back now." The message sent within seconds. The screen blinked once, delivered. Amira let out a shaky breath and placed the phone face down on her lap. She wasn't expecting much. Her godmother, Naomi Carter, might be in a meeting, or busy, or maybe no one would care. Not on this flight. That much was clear. But then, the screen lit up. A reply. Just 2 words. What happened? Amira's heart squeezed tight. She could practically hear Naomi's voice in her head. Calm, surgical, unmistakably sharp. She typed back, slower this time. "The lead flight attendant didn't believe I had a first-class ticket. Told me to move. Didn't check anything." Silence. Then another message popped up. Flight number. Amira quickly pulled the folded boarding pass from her hoodie pocket, scanned the digits, and typed, "Soul Air 1827. Sent. This time, The response came almost instantly. "Stay put. Say nothing else. I'll handle it." Amira looked up. Around her, passengers were still shuffling bags into overhead bins. A man across the aisle reviewed spreadsheets. A baby cried somewhere a few rows back. No one knew what had just been set in motion. No one knew that Naomi Carter, Director of Aviation Safety for the Federal Aviation Administration, had just triggered an emergency investigation the moment she read that message. At the FAA Ground Operations Center in Dallas-Fort Worth, Naomi reached for her official phone. Her voice was clear, direct, and sharp as glass when she connected with airport control. "This is Carter. Emergency alert. I need flight Sol Air 1827 held at the gate. Possible violation of passenger handling protocol. Minor, possible discrimination. I want an FAA compliance team at the gate upon landing. Begin logging all actions of flight crew, effective immediately." In the cockpit, the internal call light blinked sharply. Captain Jordan picked up the receiver. He listened silently. His jaw tightened as the voice on the other end calmly relayed terms like "hold a gate" and "official FAA investigation." He turned to his first officer. "We're not taking off." Then he flipped on the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an issue that needs clarification, we'll be holding at the gate for a short while. We apologize for the inconvenience and will update you shortly." The cabin fell completely silent. Amira blinked. She knew, she could feel it. Naomi was doing something. This wasn't just a godmother protecting her goddaughter anymore. This was something far bigger. A systemic intervention had begun. In first class, Karen Whitmore sipped from a paper cup, smug in her professional handling of the situation. She had no idea that every word she'd spoken, every condescending glance she'd cast at Amira, was now under scrutiny by a federal agency. Back in seat 27F, Amira sat quietly. No one asked if she was okay. No one apologized. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She was no longer just a silent girl in the back of the plane. She was a reason an entire aircraft had been brought to a halt with just one text message. Inside the cockpit, Captain Jordan placed his headset back on the control panel. His expression was grave. The call from FAA operations wasn't just an alert. It was a warning. A high-level official from the Federal Aviation Administration was now personally monitoring this flight. And the worst part? It wasn't a stranger. It was Naomi Carter. "Get the lead flight attendant up here," he said to his co-pilot. "Right now." In first class, Karen Whitmore was collecting napkins when the chime for cockpit communication lit up. She frowned, fixed her hair, and walked forward. There was no hint of unease on her face. Not yet. Not until she was asked to step into the cockpit. Inside, Captain Jordan stood up. On the main screen was a still image from the terminal security feed. And next to it, a red highlighted alert. "Emergency FAA contact. Case ID, Carter, 263. A voice crackled in through the headset. It was strong, deliberate, and left no room for ambiguity. "Ms. Whitmore, this is Harold Green, FAA Investigation Coordinator, acting under direct authorization from Director Naomi Carter. You just removed a minor, Amira Bennett, from seat 3B without conducting any formal verification. Is that correct?" Karen froze. I saw the ticket, but the girl didn't look like... I assumed." "You didn't assume," the voice cut her off. "You judged. Did you verify her name against the ground manifest?" Silence. "Did you cross-check her ticket in the airline system?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "No. We've documented this as a severe breach of passenger protocol, especially involving a minor and a matter of personal bias. Do you even know who the girl you just humiliated is?" Karen swallowed hard, her hands tightening into each other. I'm not sure." The voice turned colder. "Amira Bennett is a goddaughter of Director Naomi Carter, the federal official overseeing national aviation safety operations. And you just turned a personal lapse into a sector-wide crisis." The cockpit air turned suffocating. Captain Jordan turned away, attempting to mask his growing discomfort. "Karen, who had strutted with quiet authority just minutes earlier, now looked frozen in her press uniform. Before she could stammer a response, the voice came again, final and firm. "You will personally escort Ms. Bennett back to seat 3B immediately and offer a public apology in front of the cabin. You will then be relieved of duty and escorted from the aircraft upon landing for formal investigation. Every action is now being recorded." Back in the economy cabin, Amira sat motionless, arms still wrapped around her backpack. She didn't need to check her phone. She knew Naomi was handling it. And then the silence broke. Passengers straightened, craning to see as Karen Whitmore re-entered the cabin. But this time, there were no confident footsteps. No crisp heels echoing with precision. No cutting voice. Karen walked slowly down the aisle toward row 27. She stopped in front of Amira, eyes reddened, hands trembling slightly. "Amira Bennett," she said softly, her voice catching. I was wrong. I apologize for removing you from your seat. I had no right to do that. Please, return to your seat, 3B. Every eye in the cabin was on them. Some whispered, some looked away. The same passengers who had earlier watched in silence now lowered their heads, ashamed. Amira stood, still silent, but as she passed Karen, her gaze paused for just a second, not in anger, not in contempt, just a silence so clear it reflected the mistake better than any reprimand ever could. When she returned to first class, placed her backpack beneath the seat, and calmly fastened her seatbelt, the plane still hadn't left the gate. But this time, every pair of eyes saw her, and no one dared pretend she didn't belong. In seat 3B, Amira Bennett sat upright. She didn't say a word. Her gaze was steady, chin slightly raised, like someone balancing herself in the middle of a storm that never touched her core. The navy blue backpack lay by her feet. The book on her tray remained unopened. But for the first time, everyone in first class knew she was not invisible. There was no sound. Yet the atmosphere had undeniably changed. The same people who turned their heads away when she was escorted from her seat were now beginning to glance in her direction. The man in seat 2A stared blankly at his darkened screen, knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. The woman in 3A, with her string of pearls in perfect posture, shot a brief look toward Amira, then quickly lowered her eyes, as if avoiding a mirror that showed more than she was ready to see. A soft chime rang out. A passenger in row 27 pressed the call button. Flight attendant Marcus walked over, bent down, and listened as the man leaned in. Is the delay because of what just happened earlier?" Marcus didn't respond directly, but his eyes flicked across the cabin, pausing intentionally on Amira. "The crew is coordinating with ground control. We'll have an update shortly," he said. That was all it took. The truth began to ripple through the aircraft like a quiet crack in glass, subtle but unstoppable. In row 4, a couple whispered to each other. "She's the goddaughter of someone at the FAA. Naomi Carter, I think. Should we have done something?" the woman murmured, gripping her husband's hand. "I mean, we saw it. We saw everything." That question wasn't just for him. It echoed silently in the minds of dozens of others on board. They had heard Karen Whitmore's voice, sharp as command. They had watched Amira get led away without resistance. They had been given a chance to act, and they had chosen silence. Then, in the middle of that heavy quiet, something unexpected happened. A young passenger, Michael Ward, seated in row 6, took out his phone. He opened the camera and began recording toward the front of the cabin. "I don't plan to stay silent anymore," he said quietly, but loud enough for those around him to hear. "We say we'll stand for what's right, but when the moment comes, most of us stay seated. I don't want to stay seated today." He didn't pan or zoom. He simply captured a steady, unshaken frame of a 16-year-old black girl, sitting quietly in seat 3B. No tears, no outrage, only a stillness that felt forged in steel. That video, though it hadn't yet been uploaded, sent a pulse through the cabin, not as a headline, but as an indictment. One person spoke up. One person chose to face the truth. And then, slowly, another voice joined. A woman in row 5, older, with silver curls tucked into a neat bun, stood up. She walked over to Amira's seat, placed a gentle hand on the backrest, and leaned slightly forward. You handled that with more grace and strength than any of us. And I'm sorry I stayed quiet. Amira didn't turn. She just nodded slightly. But for the first time since returning to her seat, her shoulders softened. Not because someone had spoken for her, but because, finally, someone had listened. And in that airplane, trapped somewhere between sky and tarmac, silence was no longer a blanket hiding wrongdoing. It had become testimony. Flight 1827 remained motionless at the gate of Liberty International Airport. Outside, the yellow glow of ground support vehicles reflected off the cockpit glass, casting a tense glow over Captain Jordan's face. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere now resembled a quiet courtroom, waiting for judgment. In first class, Amira Bennett, the 16-year-old girl who had just returned to her seat after an act of public humiliation, sat still, hands folded neatly on her lap, gaze fixed out the window. She didn't need to say anything. The actions that mattered were already being carried out, on her behalf, by Naomi Carter, Director of Federal Aviation Safety, and her godmother. Back in the service galley, Chief Flight Attendant Karen Whitmore no longer wore her usual composure. Sweat dampened her uniform. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of a seat for balance, eyes flicking anxiously toward the cockpit door. Then came the electronic chime. Captain Jordan stepped out of the cockpit and walked steadily down the first-class aisle. Behind him were two FAA officers, badges gleaming under the cabin lights. He spoke softly but clearly. "Ms. Whitmore, you are requested to step out of service. There are questions waiting for you on the ground after landing." Karen froze. I've already apologized." The passenger is back in her seat. One of the FAA officers cut in, voice sharp as a scalpel. "An apology doesn't replace procedure, and no one is exempt from investigation because they're used to doing things a certain way." As Karen moved from her station, rows of eyes followed. But this time, it wasn't curiosity. It was the gaze of witnesses watching the system being held accountable. At the front of the cabin, Captain Jordan addressed the passengers over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as per request from the Federal Aviation Safety Administration, this aircraft will not depart until a full personnel review related to the earlier incident is completed. We thank you for your patience." The cabin stirred. Passengers began murmuring. Some asked others what exactly they had seen. An older couple exchanged hushed words. That girl was just sitting in her assigned seat, and she was removed just because she didn't look like she belonged in first class. Back in the galley, Flight Attendant Marcus Hale was handed a clipboard. Captain Jordan instructed him to begin a written incident report. Marcus glanced at Karen, his former training supervisor, and exhaled. "Everyone submitting a statement," the captain said. "That includes a flight crew and every passenger seated within the affected rows." An internal incident had now officially escalated into a federal-level priority case. The passengers knew they were witnesses. The crew knew they were being watched. And the 16-year-old black girl who had once been dismissed was now at the center of a growing reckoning about how the airline industry handles difference. Amira said nothing, but she knew, asterisk, the gears of justice had begun to turn. Within 48 hours of Flight 1827 being held at the gate, the name Amira Bennett had circulated through every internal bulletin across Solaire Airlines. But what unsettled the executive board wasn't the media or public outrage. It was an email from the Office of the Federal Aviation Safety Director, signed officially by Naomi Carter. There was no anger in the message, no accusation, just a list. Clear, detailed, undeniable. In it, Naomi called for the following: a full audit of staff training protocols, especially regarding minor passengers, racial minority travelers, and appropriate conduct when suspicion of ticket fraud arises. A mandatory two-step verification process before any passenger is asked to move seats. The creation of a direct reporting line between passengers and the FAA when discrimination is suspected during air travel. Douglas Whitman, CEO of Solaire, held an emergency meeting with the executive board within 12 hours. As the full email was projected across the conference room screen, He pointed to the name at the bottom and said, "That woman just redefined our future, and we're going to follow her lead." Within the same week, Solaire launched an overhauled training directive titled the NC Protocol, short for Naomi Carter. It included rigorous standards for ticket verification, passenger interaction etiquette, and required bi-monthly scenario rehearsals. Every flight attendant, pilot, and dispatch officer was ordered to participate. But Naomi didn't stop at Solaire. She filed a formal proposal to the FAA Leadership Board to establish a passenger equity alert system, an in-app reporting tool across all U.S. carriers that would allow real-time flagging of potential discrimination by passengers or crew. In a brief appearance on CNBC, Naomi stated, "Amira wasn't the first, and she won't be the last, unless we stop pretending nothing ever happens. From this moment forward, the airline industry is being held accountable for the system it built." On internal social media boards of other airlines, several younger flight attendants began posting anonymously. "I watched our cabin footage again. I realized I've stayed silent too when someone was unfairly called out." When Amira was later asked about the flight that never took off, she simply replied, "I just wanted to sit in the seat I was given." But that one quiet wish forced an entire system to move. The story swept across national headlines like a summer storm barreling into the American news cycle. But what made it powerful wasn't outrage. It was the quiet reverence for a girl who never raised her voice, yet changed everything. That 16-year-old girl, Amira Bennett, was no longer referred to by a flight number, but by a name the entire country had come to remember: the grounded girl. Within less than 48 hours, a 15-second video showing Amira walking off flight 1827, backpack clutched to her chest, head held steady, eyes forward, had racked up millions of views. She didn't look around. She didn't hang her head. She didn't challenge. She just walked, with a calm so striking it stunned the world. One article in The Atlantic read, "She didn't have to say a word. She made an entire industry stop with a single text. That's the power of truth." At a high school in Boston, a history teacher opened class by projecting a still image of Amira seated in seat 3B, with the caption, "Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's a declaration." The room fell silent. But even in the wave of national support, a moment of tension broke out during a live television broadcast on American Pulse, where Naomi Carter had been invited to discuss reform in the airline industry. A former airline union rep challenged her, claiming, "This is all overblown. That girl might have just misunderstood the situation." Naomi didn't raise her voice. She simply pulled out a slim folder containing a printed copy of Amira's boarding pass, the timestamp of her seat reassignment, and an internal audio log confirming that Karen Whitmore never verified any passenger data before issuing her order. She slid the folder across the table to her challenger. "This is an emotion," Naomi said, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "This is data." That episode would go on to become one of the most rewatched and shared broadcasts in the show's history. Meanwhile, Amira kept living her life. She declined most interview requests. When asked why, she simply said, "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't want to be pushed out of my seat." That answer hit home. A professor at Harvard called her a model of quiet civic strength, proof that you don't need a microphone to make change. A student group in Oakland launched a campaign named Seat 3B, advocating for equity in both education and public transportation. Then one quiet spring night, in a modest community center in New Jersey, a gathering took place, a tribute to unsung citizens. There were no news crews, no red carpet, just warm yellow lighting, sincere applause, and a single chair at the center of the stage. Seat 3B. Amira walked up quietly, sat down, folded her hands gently over her knees, like she was just preparing for another flight. But this time, the entire room stood up, and no one stayed seated. At a closed-door conference room inside the regional headquarters of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, in New Jersey, harsh white light reflected off a stainless steel table, catching every weary blink like a silent metronome of tension. Across the table sat two federal investigators, a legal counsel representing Solaire Airlines, and at the far end, Karen Whitmore, Gone was the crisp uniform. Gone was a commanding voice, cold and composed. Karen now wore a pale gray sweater, her hair tied neatly back, eyes swollen from sleepless nights. On the table in front of her lay a typed incident report, stamped in red with the FAA seal, bearing a bold header. Incident involving passenger Amira Bennett, Seoul Air Flight 1827. "We need to reaffirm your statement," said the lead investigator, his tone devoid of hostility, but also absent of sympathy. "You confirm that you requested the passenger to move from her seat in first class because why?" Karen swallowed hard, eyes fixed on an invisible space between her tightly clasped hands. "I didn't think she looked like a first-class passenger." The words felt like a quiet gunshot. No outcry, no gasp, but the silence that followed said enough. The Seoul Air attorney tilted his head, exhaling through his nose. The investigator gave a single, subtle nod, as though checking a box he already knew he'd have to mark. This wasn't professional oversight. This was systemic bias. And today, it had a name, evidence, and someone to hold accountable. "Your actions," the investigator continued, "did not only violate the basic civil rights of a paying minor passenger, they directly contradicted every principle of passenger service and aviation ethics." Karen didn't speak. She knew that any defense now would ring hollow. The truth had already aired. The country had already seen the eyes of a 16-year-old girl. Not angry, not vengeful, simply quiet, yet filled with a message the system had long refused to hear. "I belong here." When Karen left that room, a thick envelope was waiting for her at the front desk. Inside, Seoul Air's official termination letter. No apology, no exit bouquet, just a 15-year career, summed up by 3 cold words. Ethical misconduct confirmed. Less than 2 weeks after Flight South Australia 1827 was grounded, the entire U.S. aviation industry found itself amid a reckoning no one saw coming. Major airlines scrambled to convene emergency board meetings. And at the center of the storm, Seoul Air Airlines, now under the fiercest scrutiny in its history. During a nationally televised press conference at Seoul Air's New Jersey headquarters, CEO Douglas Whitman stood before a row of microphones, his face pale, his voice trembling under the weight of public outrage. "We are not making excuses," he said. "We are listening, and we will change." But the FAA, under the firm and watchful direction of Director Naomi Carter, did not let the issue dissolve into corporate regret and talking points. A wave of emergency mandates followed. Comprehensive overhauls of seat verification protocols. Implementation of an anonymous internal reporting system for discrimination. A nationwide recertification program for aviation personnel, with a laser focus on racial bias and civil liberties in the air. Naomi never appeared on television. She never sought the spotlight. But every sentence in the FAA's new training manual bore her unmistakable imprint. Firm, unflinching, and free of blame. Naomi always believed, accountability doesn't begin with humiliation. It begins with the courage to confront the root. And what about Amira Bennett? She still went to school like any other teen. Still took the bus every morning. Still ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch. The media called her the grounded girl, the one who stopped a flight with a single message. But Amira never saw herself as a symbol. "I just wanted to sit in the seat I was assigned," she said in one rare interview. No more, but also no less. And perhaps it was that quiet simplicity that turned Amira into an invisible beacon for millions of others who had, at some point, been asked to step away from the space they belonged in, simply because someone didn't believe they did. One late autumn afternoon at a Newark community center, soft sunlight spilled through a small classroom window. Amira Bennett sat in a gray plastic chair at the back of the room, facing nearly 24 young girls who looked at her with wide eyes. Curious, searching for something school books had never quite taught them. A shy 8th grader raised her hand. "Miss Amira, were you scared when everyone stared at you?" Amira smiled gently, her gaze steady. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was, but I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't need to make a speech. I just told the truth and let the adults handle the rest." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that listens. "I think you're really brave," another girl offered. Amira shook her head softly. "I didn't feel brave. I just didn't want to sit in the wrong seat. I didn't want someone else to be told to leave just because no one believed they belonged." That story, from a first-class seat on Flight South, Australia 1827, to this humble classroom, was no longer just an isolated incident. It had become required study in pilot academies, cabin crew trainings, and even policy seminars. People no longer called it the incident. They called it the lesson. At a university in Michigan, a module titled The Ethics of Assumption featured Amira's case as its centerpiece. Meanwhile, the FAA rolled out a mandatory training video that ended with these words across a black screen: "A valid ticket needs no permission. Dignity doesn't wear a uniform, and the truth doesn't have to shout to be heard." Amira never took the stage. She didn't write a book. She didn't sign T-shirts that said "Grounded Girl." But in the hearts of millions, especially the young ones who've been doubted, dismissed, or told, "You don't look like someone who belongs there," she left behind the most important thing: a seat, uncontested, acknowledged, and rightfully hers. A single flight had stopped, but the machinery of reform was now fully in motion, engineered not by outrage, but by quiet resolve.